Hello, denizens of the internet. My name is Winnie Weedy Vorthos, and I like to make Vorthos Magic the Gathering decks that are as competitive as possible. I've made a few decks on this channel so far, and for the most part, they've been pretty standard fare, you know? I've made a control style deck, a mid-range artifact deck, and a Tron variant, each one with their own added spice to really help make the decks interesting in their own way. Go check those videos out, maybe if you're interested in this kind of content. So for this one, I think it's time we got a little bit weird with it. Let me ask you something. Do you like math?
That's right, Mookie. We're doing mathematics. Math!
Up. Don't you go anywhere. I see you, math haters. But you clicked on this video about a game which heavily features math as a core mechanic, so I get to assume that you like math to some degree. Because let's face it, math is pretty neat. It's all around us in ways most people don't even think about the majority of the time. The world runs on mathematics, patterns which define reality but continuously defies them. All of the architecture in the world, the vehicles you're in and day out, the game we play, even the card stock on which the game is played in paper, none of it would be possible without math. And the natural world is no exception to this law either. If you look around enough, math can be found all over how nature operates, from the structures of plants to how much force an earthquake needs to exert to fell a tree, the amount of energy the sun provides to keep us all warm, the rhythmic push and pull of the tide by the gravitational pull of the moon, and I, for one, think that's pretty cool. Today's deck text theme is math in a broad sense, but in a more specific one, it's Quandrix. If you don't recognize that name, let me give you a little refresher. Quandrix refers to the College of Numerology on the plane of Arcavios, where the Strixhaven set took place. The set was a reimagining of the color pairs that originally found their identity set more concrete on Ravnica with the guilds, and, as such, a lot of players felt that the colleges were just watered-down versions of the Ravnican guilds. I disagree. I feel like the Strixhaven colleges did a fine job of reinterpreting the color combinations in new and interesting ways. Going into this set, I expected to like Silverquill the best, but as the set became fully revealed, I was surprised to find that it was Quandrix that stood out the most to me. This was due to a lot of reasons that, by and large, I won't be getting into here, but to condense it all down, Quandrix, as a reimagining of the Simic color pair of blue-green, just ended up making the most cohesive sense overall in its presentation, its mechanics, and its real-world counterparts. In other words, Quandrix, more than any of the other colleges, felt the most Vorthos to me. So, much to my surprise, it was the college that I gravitated towards the most despite not having a particular affinity for the blue-green color combination over others of their liking. So what exactly do I like about Quandrix over Simic? I think the main thing is that I like the specificity of Quandrix. If you look at Simic cards, they do have a similar overarching set of themes. The mad scientist archetype, the splicing of creatures into each other, bioengineering, a sort of vague science as magic vibe in general, really. If you had to pick one field of science that the Simic fell into, I think most people would agree that biology is the category for them. Even so, and just from this brief summary, I've split that field apart into 4 separate subcategories that only serve to muddy the water as to what makes a Simic guildmage Simic in the first place. Identifying as Simic can mean a lot of things for you as a player. There's far less vagueness when it comes to Quandrix. A student of the College of Numerology is there for one reason, and it's all in the name. Numbers. Math. Whether it's in the art of the cards, the naming conventions, or the mechanics, the clear and cohesive theme has math as a source of magical power for the inhabitants of this plane that attend this college rings true and clear. I realize that specificity makes the appeal much less far-reaching than that of the Simic Guild, but as a Vorthos player, I much prefer the laser focus that Quandrix cards have over Simic, as it makes them feel more well thought out as a whole to me. Alright, now that that's out of the way, I think you might be surprised to find that there isn't much of a story on how this deck was created. Rather, we already went over it, more or less. This is a more recent deck that I created that's not been updated too much over the years, and it really did just come out of existence after I looked at the Strixhaven cards and noticed how cool I found the Quandrix ones. My hope is that someday in the future, a couple of years from now, when we return to Arcavios, we'll get some new Quandrix cards that will rock my world, and this deck will receive an update video. I can't explain the name really quick though, as I think it's really neat and is extremely fitting for a deck themed around the Quandrix school of numerology. So, a lot of you probably looked at the video title, Modern Homebrew 3x+1, and wondered why I put an algebra problem in the title for this deck. The answer is that this isn't an algebra problem. It's an impossible to solve mathematical conjecture. At least, I think it is. There is an excellent video that goes over the many different facets of this conjecture, which is known as Colot's conjecture, by the way, which I will put into the description below, and I highly encourage you to go watch it if you want to learn something extremely interesting in the world of mathematics. But, to put it in simple terms, 3x+1 is a math problem that has 3 simple rules. You pick a number, literally any number, it doesn't matter what it is, and insert it for x. Then solve the equation. If the number is even, divide it by 2. If the number is odd after doing this, insert the new number in for x and start the sequence over. If you do this enough, no matter what number it is, eventually you'll end up in a loop of 4, 2, and 1. That will infinitely cycle back into each other. And the thing is, we don't really know why. Again, I highly encourage you to go watch that video for a deeper explanation, but that's where this deck gets its name from. As I'm writing this section out, I'm realizing that the name is even more fitting than I realized due to the deck's propensity to end up winning games in a specific sequence of events, but we'll go over that in just a moment. So, I just said that this deck oftentimes ends up winning games by a specific sequence of events, and that's true to an extent. A game of Magic the Gathering isn't a perfectly sterile math problem. We have to account for variant and alternative ways of winning the game. This deck has 2 main ways of winning. The first is good old-fashioned beatdown with some big creatures. And trust me, they can get quite gargantuan in this deck. And this is where variance rears its ugly head, because just from that way of winning alone, there's a few ways that this deck can achieve victory. Whether that's going wide with a board of a few medium-sized creatures that go unanswered, or are simply large enough to overpower our opponent's board, or going high up over their heads of our opponent's creatures with flying. The exact way in which you can win by smacking your opponent's life is a fractal, with many different patterns of play you can follow, but ultimately lead to the same victory. The second way which this deck can win is through mill, believe it or not. The especially clever among you probably heard the word mill after what I said about the creatures in this deck and instantly connected how this deck can win that way. And to you I say, good job! Well done for having a big brain, which is obviously a prerequisite for piloting this deck. For those of you who did not immediately understand the winning card,
You fool! You fool like everyone else, monkey!
I'll tell you this much. We're not utilizing traditional mill cards you might find in a modern deck today. So what cards are we using to win the game? The 3 cards that I would really call win conditions for this deck all feed back into each other in different ways, much like the 4-2-1 pattern of the Colot's conjecture, ensuring that the game ends in a few select but inevitable ways for us when piloting this deck. Ultimately, what this deck wants to do, at the very core of its being, mechanically speaking, is very simple. Make huge creatures. How we get there and how we use those creatures is the interesting part. Our first win con, and really the one that comes up most often, the one, if you will, is Altar of Dementia. For 2 generic mana, we get an artifact where, at any time, we may sacrifice a creature and have target player mill cards equal to the creature's power. all of you big brain players out there, give yourself another pat on the back for seeing this one coming. For everyone else, do not underestimate the simple beauty of this card in a deck which is designed to make absurdly enormous creatures. Make no mistake, it is possible to win with Altar of Dementia out of nowhere, completely milling your opponent's deck away in a single shot. Personally, I like to imagine that doing so is tantamount to presenting your opponent with a mathematical proof so complex and mind-blowing that they literally cannot take it, and they suffer from instantaneous brain rot as they try to fathom something they simply can't understand in a mathematical sense. The deck is only running 2 of them though, and that's going to be a bit of a theme going forward: low card count. I'll go over this more thoroughly when I cover the deck's weaknesses, but let's just say that variance is a bit higher in this deck than in other decks for the sake of having more card options at our disposal. Exponential Growth, a wonderfully named card, Twofold Puns, is a sorcery for double X and 2 green mana that reads, until the end of turn, double target creature's power X times. Much like 3x+1, this is a very simple effect on the surface that has multiple branching pathways for use in this deck. The effect of doubling a creature's power X times is straightforward, but what we end up doing with that often depends on the board state itself, particularly with one creature that we are running. As I said, this card interacts with the other win conditions of the deck, so for Altar of Dementia, it can be used to elevate a creature to a power which is lethal to our opponents if we have the altar in play, or we can just make a creature extremely large out of nowhere and swing for lethal. The key to proper use of this card is timing though, because it's a sorcery. For that reason, and others, we're only running 1 copy. The last main win con of the deck is Body of Research, a sorcery we can cast for 6 mana, 3 blue and 3 green. When we do, we create a blue and green fractal creature token with X +1/+1 counters on it, equal to the number of cards in our library. This card is amazingly cool, and I love it. It's a unique effect making a token creature with a variable power and toughness based on the number of cards in your deck, with a naming scheme that essentially means the sum total of your work, kind of like how the deck of Magic: The Gathering is in terms of an expression of the player. On a more mechanical level, this card touches up not just one of the themes of the deck, but a couple of sub-strategies the deck employs as well: fractal token creation and +1/+1 counter generation. Fractals, as a creature type, are truly genius in my opinion. The mathematical manifestation of a life form born from mathematical infinity is such a great concept. Anyways, Body of Research synergizes with the other 2 win cons of this deck nicely by creating an absolutely massive creature. Just an absolute unit that we can make even larger with Exponential Growth, or we can potentially mill our opponent's deck in a single go with Altar of Dementia. Now, I will say up front that, in most games, it would be a waste to use Exponential Growth on a fractal token created with Body of Research, as it will already be massive. I've never made a token that was less than 36/36 with this card. The average is about 45, and that should usually be enough to end the game one way or another. The biggest creature I ever made with this deck in an actual game had over 200 power and toughness though, and you never know when you might face a Battle of Wits deck. It is extremely unlikely to happen though, which is part of the reason we're only running 1 copy of it. Now, unlike my previous decks where there haven't really been a distinction between primary and secondary win cons, this deck pretty firmly has that in the form of one of the biggest creatures that we're running, Tanazir Quandrix. For 5 mana, 3 generic, a blue, and a green, we get a legendary creature Elder Dragon with 4 power and toughness that has flying and trample. When he enters the battlefield, we double the number of +1/+1 counters on target creature we control, and when he attacks, we can have every other creature we control have base power and toughness equal to Tanazir Quandrix's power and toughness. I want to put emphasis on that because for the longest little bit, I didn't quite get the impact of that ability. But Quandrix the dragon can make it so that every combat, all of our creatures' base power and toughness are equal to whatever his is, meaning that any creatures we control with +1/+1 counters on them get even larger rather than potentially shrinking down. And if Quandrix himself has +1/+1 counters on him, his total power and toughness buffs up the rest of the creatures you control, not just his base power and toughness. I apologize for this over-explanation, but I really wanted it to be crystal clear how having Tanazir Quandrix out on an established board can and will be game-ending more often than not, even if he doesn't have any counters on him, although he oftentimes will. For starters, all fractal creature tokens we make have a base power and toughness of 0, so that becomes 4 plus whatever counters they happen to have on them at the time. Because of how Quandrix's ability works, he is the target for exponential growth in this deck. Our other creatures we either cast or make can be fine targets in a pinch, but it's in here for Quandrix's sake, because he can make all of our other creatures as large as him each and every combat step. A well-timed exponential growth with a good amount of mana pumped into it can, and will, mean the end of the game for our opponents, doubly so if we happen to have an Altar of Dementia out. It's possible to mill our opponents just with Quandrix's base power if we have a sufficient amount of fractals in play and our opponent is a deck that draws a bunch of cards or self-mills like Dredge or Murktide. On top of all of that, Quandrix doubles the number of +1/+1 counters on a creature we control each time he enters the battlefield, which is far from insignificant for us in a number of ways. That time I got a creature to be as big as 200 something? That was because of Quandrix doubling a fractal's counters at least once. Honestly, what more do I need to say? He's a big threat that can and will make our entire board big threats right along with him that has evasion and trample. There's a reason why the college is named after him. We run 3 copies. For bonus Vorthos flavor, I recommend running the original art version of him, actually, as if you look closely at his art, it's full of fun math-related art choices that make me giddy to see. So now that we have the win conditions out of the way, let's go over the parts of the equation that hold it all together. We'll start with the creatures. Now, technically speaking, the majority of creatures we run in the deck are fractal tokens, and we have a lot of ways of making those, but we do run a couple of solid creature choices as a good foundation. First off, Birds of Paradise. I don't feel like I have too much to say here. It's classic. A 0/1 flyer for 1 green mana that can tap to add 1 mana of any color. It's iconic. The reason the phrase "bolt the bird" exists in this game. Now, I do want to say this about the bird, especially as it pertains to its placement in this deck. Birds of Paradise isn't special. This slot could feasibly go to any 1-drop mana dork you have or prefer, like Llanowar Elves or Delighted Halfling. There is something to be said about running Noble Hierarch in particular over the board, as it not only taps for the colors we care about, but it has Exalted, making our creatures larger when they attack alone. Very mathematical. The reason I'm choosing to run the bird over the Hierarch, personally, is its ability to fly. Having a creature that can fly when Quandrix enters the battlefield and change its base power and toughness can come in clutch, giving us another way to go over our opponent's creatures' heads for some nice damage. Ultimately, this slot can be reserved for whatever you value most. Aggression in the early game? Hierarch's probably for you. Protection for a win con? The Halfling got your back. Budget? Can't be Llanowar Elves. I'll say it again. Birds of Paradise isn't special, but we are running 3 copies. The next creature we're running is Biomathematician, a human wizard creature that costs 3 mana, 1 generic, 1 blue, and 1 green, that has 2 power and toughness. When it enters the battlefield, we create a fractal creature token and put a number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to the number of fractals we control. The most exemplar member of the College of Numerology, beyond the founding dragon himself in my opinion, Biomathematician does everything we want a creature to do in this deck, making 2 bodies when it enters the battlefield, one of which is a fractal, which come into play with +1/+1 counters. It's great for us at any point in the game and can come down as early as turn 2. What's particularly nice about Biomathematician is that it's good for us no matter when we play it, and only gets exponentially better the more fractals we have in play. We're running 3 copies of it. I'd also ask you to take a moment to appreciate that artwork. It's gorgeous, and features a Fibonacci spiral front and center, which is so on theme for a college of magical math students, it's incredible. The last 2 creatures in the deck I'm going to go over together because we're running only 1 copy of each, and their inclusion, which is a touch thematic, is mostly for mechanical benefits. Endurance and Subtlety are a pair of now infamous cycle of evoke elementals released in Modern Horizons 2, and, in this deck, we are going to be using them as Richard Garfield intended more often than not, which is to say, we only want to evoke these in emergencies where doing so will save us from losing the game. Otherwise, we hardcast them. We'll go over Endurance first, the embodiment of that particular trait which all who study mathematics must have. See, I told you there's a touch of thematics in their inclusion. For 3 mana, 1 generic, and 2 green, we get an elemental creature with 3 power and 4 toughness that has flash and reach. When it enters the battlefield, target player puts all cards they own in their graveyard on the bottom of their library in a random order. We can also evoke it by exiling a green card from our hand rather than paying its casting costs, meaning it will enter the battlefield and then immediately be sacrificed. Endurance is here for a couple of reasons, not the least of which being its stats. It's got a nice, chunky body about it that we can make bigger with counters, which is nice, but it can also tuck away our opponent's graveyard into their library to stop Murktide, Living In, Dredge, or any other graveyard-based deck from doing their thing. Primarily, though, Endurance is here for our graveyard, a way to put all of the things we've cast and or lost over the course of the game back into the deck to be played again. It's important to recognize when it's best to do this, though, as it may oftentimes be more prudent to do this to your opponent's grave instead of your own. Basically, keep an eye on whether or not your opponent cares about their grave, as well as what's in yours, particularly instants and sorceries, which we'll go over why that's important in a bit. Subtlety, another key trait for any aspiring Quandrix student, is an elemental creature that costs 4 mana, 2 generic and 2 blue. It has 3 power and toughness, flash, and flying. When it enters the battlefield, we choose up to 1 target creature or planeswalker spell that's on the stack. Its owner chooses whether it goes on the top or bottom of their library. We can also evoke it by exiling a brew card from our hand. Out of the 2 of these elementals, Subtlety is far more likely to sit and chill in our hands until the right moment to play it. And we're also far more likely to actually take advantage of that evoke mechanic than we are with Endurance. Sometimes, a single turn of protection against an oncoming threat is all we need to win the game, and Subtlety provides that. It also helps that it's another flyer for our Quandrix to beef up. Its usage is far more narrow and specific than what Endurance has for us, as we'll rarely be using it to protect one of our own creatures on the stack, but it can come in clutch, just like Endurance, and that's why we're only running 1 of each. That's all of the creatures we're running. Now, let's go over the instants. We're only running 2 of them in the main deck, but they're both important for us. Starting with the more dynamic of the 2, Quandrix Command is an instant for 3 mana, 1 generic, 1 green, 1 blue. That's a modal spell. When we cast it, we get to pick 2 options out of the list of 4. We can return target creature or planeswalker to its owner's hand, counter target artifact or enchantment spell, put 2+1/+1 counters on target creature, or have target player shuffle up to 3 cards in their graveyard back into their library. The command cycle of cards have always been pretty powerful, because modal spells are powerful, particularly because of their ability to let us choose 2 options. Quandrix command does a lot for this deck. Kind of everything we want it to do. Running down the list, we can bounce a creature or planeswalker back to hand. A nice way to deal with potential threats coming from our opponent, at least temporarily, no doubt, but also a protection and utility for us. Never underestimate the ability to bounce a much needed creature, probably Quandrix as he's our most impactful creature in the deck, in response to a removal spell. By far our most common line of play with this first ability, though, is returning our own Biomathematician back to hand so that we can cast it again. More cast with the Mathematician means more fractals and more +1/+1 counters in play. Very important to us. So oftentimes our best line of play is to choose this first mode on the command targeting a Biomathematician in play. If it's late enough in the game, we can just play it again immediately and be up 1 creature than we were that will inevitably be larger than our other fractals as well, usually. Next up is the counter ability, and it's a good one. Only being able to counter an artifact or enchantment is pretty narrow, admittedly, but think about it. A lot of the most prominent cards in Modern right now are artifacts or enchantments. Powerful cards like the One Ring or Leyline Binding immediately come to mind, but there are plenty of other examples of especially artifacts, which we can counter with this card and get a secondary benefit out of, like bouncing a Biomathematician back to hand. To reiterate, next is putting 2+1/+1 counters on a creature, and this is probably the most big option out of all of them. The other 3 choices are situational, and we need to think about them a little before making a choice. But this one, as long as we have a creature in play we can target, whether it's a fractal or a bird, we're probably going to pick this option. +1/+1 counters are pretty integral for the game plan of this deck, if it isn't obvious already. So the more of them we have, generally speaking, the better, which is why we picked this mode more than any other. Lastly, and perhaps the most complicated mode, is the ability to put 3 cards from a graveyard into their owner's library and shuffle. Now, being perfectly honest, this last mode will way more often than not target our own grave, letting us tuck cards back in that we may want to use again into our library. And note the wording on that. Cards. Any card type we want, we can get back. So, if we've lost a creature, or cast one of our win conditions already that didn't quite pan out, or maybe we just want to put a land back into the deck that's ended up in the grave. The versatility of this is off the charts. I want to point out that, so long as one of the cards we pick in the graveyard is another Quandrix command, we will never run out of cards to draw in our library, as we can repeatedly cast the command, target a second one, and 2 other cards to put back into our library. It's not likely to come up, but if you happen to find yourself against a mill deck, know that 2 Quandrix commands is a panacea to mill so long as you can cast it. Of course, we aren't technically limited to our own graveyard. We can return cards in our opponent's grave to their library, which, situationally, can prove to be useful in stopping them from reanimating something or removing some key combo piece that they need in the grave to use. It also does force your opponent to shuffle, so if they're doing some top deck manipulation, you can put a stop to whatever they've loaded up by doing this. Nonetheless, we will be using this on our own yard more often than not, and all 4 modes are excellent choices for us. We're running 3 of them. Divide by Zero is an instant costing 3 mana, 2 generic and 1 blue. When it's cast, we can return target spell or permanent with mana value 1 or greater to its owner's hand. We can also learn, which is a keyword that lets us specifically find a lesson card that we own from outside of the game, or discard a card to draw a card. Divide by Zero has a lot of moving parts to it. Let's start with the name. Everyone's heard of dividing something by zero. It's a famous mathematical conundrum. A lot of people are under the impression that you can't divide by zero. Others only know of it because of the joke of the universe imploding. I've always been taught that dividing anything by zero equals zero, a return to nothing, which is what this card does, bouncing a permanent or spell back to its owner's hand, which effectively makes it a counter spell and a bounce spell for us. As such, it performs all of the same functions as two of the modes on Quandrix command, with the added benefit of hitting more targets. The only downside is that it can't target things with mana value 0, which is both funny and appropriate. For us, we'll mostly be using this in order to bounce Biomathematician back to our hand. Don't be afraid to use it as a counterspell, or return something of our opponents back to their hand. Remember that we can get this card back with the command for potential repeated usage. Lastly is the Learn keyword, which will let us pick up a lesson card from our sideboard if we want, or discard a card to draw a card if we don't. This is a very versatile on-flavor spell for us. We're running 2 of them, the same number of lessons that we're running. Let's quickly take a peek at the sideboard to go over those now. Mercurial Transformation is a 2-mana sorcery for 1 generic and 1 blue. When it resolves, target non-land permanent becomes our choice of a 1/1 blue frog creature or a 4/4 blue octopus creature until the end of the turn, and it loses all abilities. That last part is the important part of this lesson. Making something lose all abilities as well as changing its card type can be very useful to us, effectively becoming a removal spell even if only for a single turn. It's worth noting that this lesson lets us change things like planeswalkers, artifacts, and enchantments into valid targets for Quandrix command's bounce ability, which could come in handy, but mostly we'll be using it to turn off specific card effects that could be bothering us, like Ensnaring Bridge, planeswalkers with static abilities, or enchantments like Blood Moon. What's funny about Mercurial Transformation, other than that frog just sitting there in the cage chilling, like come on, that's adorable, is whatever we transform our opponent is unlikely to block with, since it will probably be more important for them to keep around than to lose on a bad trade we're forcing on them this turn, unless they'd lose the game otherwise, which means free damage for us. Turning things into a frog is more often than not the ability we'll choose with this sorcery, but I'd remiss if I didn't point out that we can also turn one of our own creatures into a 4/4 octopus until the end of the turn, preferably a smaller creature like Biomathematician or Birds of Paradise, doubly preferably if they have any +1/+1 counters on it like a Fractal. We're only running 2 copies because we only have 2 divide by zeros in the deck, but don't count this sorcery out just because it's quirky. Speaking of sorceries, let's return back to the main deck and get to those. Emergent Sequence is a 2-mana sorcery for 1 generic and 1 green mana. When it resolves, we search our library for a basic land and put it into play tapped. That land becomes a fractal creature in addition to still being a land, and gets a number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to the number of lands that enter the battlefield under our control this turn. This card is an all-star in the deck, oftentimes our most sought after turn 2 play. It kind of does it all for us. It's a ramp spell, it creates a fractal, which Biomathematician cares about, and it generates counters. On turn 2, we can pretty easily and consistently have 3 lands interplay that turn thanks to a fetch land and the sequence counting the land it fetches as well. In later turns, if we have a fetch land and multiple copies of this in hand, it can easily be more. A very satisfying card to play in our deck because of all the sequencing and numbers involved. We're running a full playset. Solve the Equation is a sorcery for 3 mana, 2 generic and 1 blue. When it resolves, we search our library for an instant or sorcery card, reveal it, and put it into our hand. Mystic Tutor this is not, but it is a tutor effect that we can use to search up 2/3 of our win conditions or anything else we might need in the moment that we can find a use for. A straightforward effect on a straightforward card, we're running 3 of them. The last sorcery we're running in the deck and my personal favorite, is Golden Ratio. For 3 mana, 1 generic, 1 green, and 1 blue, we get a sorcery that lets us draw cards equal to the number of creatures we control with different powers. If it wasn't completely obvious by now, this deck runs or can create a wide variety of creatures which come with different powers attached to them, and each and every one of those creatures are malleable thanks to our ability to apply +1/+1 counters as needed, something we'll go over more in a little bit. As such, it's fairly easy for us to get multiple creatures out that end up having different powers. Imagine, if you will, this turn sequence. Turn 1, play the bird. Turn 2, emergence sequence off of a fetch land so that we get a fractal with 3 power. Turn 3, play a biomathematician that makes a fractal, then turn 4, play Golden Ratio and refill your hand. It's just that easy. Now, granted, that's assuming the best case scenario and our opponents doesn't have any kind of removal, but that's still a good amount of card draw that only becomes better as the game goes on and we're allowed to have a board state. It's the artwork that really sells it for me though. It forms a Golden Ratio. How cool is that? If you don't know what that is, look it up and learn something mathematically awesome today. We're running a full playset. Now that we've gone over the instants and sorceries, let's move on to the artifacts. We've already gone over one of them, our win condition of Altar of Dementia, but we're running a pair of twins that help us out with everything else we're doing as well. The Ozolith is a generic 1 mana legendary artifact, and before I go any further, I'm pulling the cat out of the bag early. Surprise, surprise, surprise! This deck is a hardened scale shell all along. Everyone that saw this coming, go get yourself a cookie. Treat yourself. Anyways, the Ozolith is an artifact that makes it so that any counters that get removed from permanents we control go to the Ozolith to hold on to until the beginning of combat on our turn, where we can then dump all of said counters onto a creature of our choice. Here's where all those +1/+1 counters really begin to matter in this deck. Welcome to the payoffs. The Ozolith is how we can use numerology to our advantage with our win cons to really melt our opponent's minds with math. Think about it. So long as the Ozolith is out on the field, all of the counters we put on our creatures don't go to waste. If a fractal gets removed or beaten in combat, the Ozolith holds on to its counters to put onto the next one, or any other creature of our choice. Same for anything else we put counters on with Quandrix command. Did we play a body of research and get a 40 power and toughness creature that our opponent fatal pushed? Cool story. We'll have another one out very shortly. Was that not enough to win the game? All good. If we have Altar of Dementia out, our opponents can kiss their libraries goodbye if we have a board state that's set up with a good amount of counters, because we're very much not afraid of losing our creatures if the Ozolith is here to back us up and hold all of our big boy numbers. Truly an immensely satisfying payoff for playing this deck, even more so than in Hardened Scales, I'd say, because of just how ridiculously fun it is to make gargantuan creatures with it. It's just a shame that we can only run 2 of them. Thankfully, Golden Ratio helps draw us into our low numbered cards like this. I said we're running twins and I meant it, because Ozolith the sequel is here as well. Ozolith the Shattered Spire is a 2 mana legendary artifact for 1 generic and 1 green that has a few effects. The first makes it so that anytime we put a +1/+1 counter on something, we put that many +1 of those counters instead. The second ability lets us pay 2 mana, the same as its casting cost, tap it, and put a +1/+1 counter on an artifact or creature we control. Sadly, this ability can only be activated as sorcery, but I do want to point out that it synergizes with itself, meaning each activation actually puts 2 counters onto something instead. Lastly, we can cycle it away for 2 generic mana if we have it in hand and for some reason don't want to cast it. Ozolith the sequel is every bit as much of a card we want for this deck as the original counterpart is, pulling double duty as copies 4 and 5 of Hardened Scales for us, as well as a way to put 2 counters onto something of our choice each and every turn, meaning we don't have to rely on the command or Ozolith the original to put counters on stuff. This invariably makes our creatures bigger than they were already going to be. It's great, and that's why we're running 2 copies of it. The last non-land card we're running is Hardened Scales. Shocker, I know. It's almost like I didn't give it away 2 minutes ago. Experienced modern players don't need a refresher on this, but for those new to the format or maybe just have never seen this card, Hardened Scales is an enchantment we can cast for 1 green mana that has the same ability as Ozolith the sequel insofar as putting additional counters onto things whenever they have +1/+1 counters placed on them. This is here for all the same reasons as Shattered Spire. It just does a little less than it does, but still pulls a lot of weight in this deck. The meta deck it's named after is called that for a reason. We're running 3 copies of it. That's going to do it for the spells on the main deck. Now let's have a look at the mana base. And for all the complexity and lines of play possible in the main deck, thankfully the mana is fairly straightforward. To start us off, we're running the Fetch and Shockland combos of Misty Rainforest and Breeding Pool. There's not too much to say here. Most modern decks which run multiple colors will have some number of these, and for us they're even more important because of the line of play I mentioned earlier with Emergence Sequence. Not going to spend a lot of time on this, most everyone knows why these are great, and if you don't, I'd recommend looking up a video as to why Fetch and Shocklands play so nice together. Play sets of each of them. Next up we're running Vine Glimmer Snarl, a slightly odd choice of non-basic dual land to some, but I feel like the reveal land cycle have been getting more and more popular lately. Anyways, it taps for blue and green and will enter the battlefield tapped unless we reveal a forest or an island in our hand. Not very hard to do. There isn't too much mechanical advantage over running this instead of, say, a check land or another non-basic of your choice, but it is slightly more on theme since this snarl is associated with the Quandrix College, which is why I, personally, included it, a full playset. The next land we're running is Waterlogged Grove, the Quandrix colored canopy land. Much like the Fetch and Shock lands, the canopy land cycle is unquestionably powerful, even if it does cost us a bit of life whenever we use it for mana. That bit of pain for the trade-off of being able to draw a card at a point of our choosing by paying 1 of any color, tapping, and sacrificing it makes it well worth it. That card draw ability is exactly why we're running it as well, just for that extra bit of power off the top of the deck when we need it. A solid land, we're running a full playset. The last lands we're running are the basics, 6 of them in total, split evenly down the middle, 3 of each islands and forests. Now, as always, you can use whatever basic lands you happen to have or those which you prefer, they're just basics after all. But, for maximum flavor, you'll want to use 1 or more of the artworks of these lands I have on the screen, as these are, as far as I can tell, the most mathematical basic lands in both islands and forests that I know about. Well, okay, tell a lie. They're not the most. That goes to the Guru lands, which have these amazing panoramas of a double eclipse with drawings of a sextant in the background charting the course of the eclipse over the sky, something which takes real-world math to pull off. But, sadly, these lands alone would cost you more than every other deck in Modern and then some, just for these 6 lands. So, if you want to have maximum flavor, I'd recommend choosing between the Hour of Devastation full arts, which achieve a very similar effect as the Eclipse in the Guru lands without all the math drawn right on the art, the New Capenna full arts, which feature cityscapes and statues, both of which you know were made with math, and the Esper Island from Shards of Alara. Much like the Guru lands, the art of this card is riddled with mathematical symmetry as well as a star chart in the skyline. An absolutely stunning piece of art. Pick which lands are your favorites. That's it for the main deck, but what about the sideboard? We've already gone over one of the cards in here, Mercurial Transformation, so let's go over what other pieces of essential goodies we bring in for games 2 and onward. Starting us off, we have Pongify, an instant for 1 blue mana that lets us destroy target creature and that creature can't be regenerated. In its place, the owner of said creature gets a 3/3 green 8 creature token. As I'm sure most of you know, removal in these colors is hard to come by, and while it was tempting to put both Pongify and Rapid Hybridization into the sideboard for games where we really just want to destroy some creatures our opponents control, I rationalized that bouncing creatures is something we can already do, and it's kind of removal. Mostly, we just don't have the space to run both of them. But Pongify fits right alongside Mercurial Transformation as spells which turn our opponent's creatures into other creatures. A rare removal piece in these colors that doesn't rely on a gimmick like the fight mechanic, which I really have never liked. We'll use this on basically any creature we don't like that we can't bully into submission with raw might of numbers. Whether that's because it's a troubling effect, or it's just plain bigger than anything we currently have. It's always nice to have some removal in your decks, which is why we're running a full playset. Terra Sunder is an instant for 2 mana, 1 generic and 1 green, that lets us exile target artifact or enchantment. It has a kicker effect that would let us exile any non-land permanent instead, but we don't care about that. Can't produce black mana in the first place, and the first half of this card is good enough on its own already. The reason we're running this card over cards like Nature's Claim is for one simple little word: exile. Exiling rather than destroying lets us get around pesky artifacts and enchantments with Indestructible, namely the One Ring, but also anything else like, say, the Theros gods, Heliod Suncrowned for instance. There's nothing really math related about this card, but it's good for us in the current modern meta, which is why we run 4 of them. Decisive Denial is a 2 mana instant for 1 green and 1 blue that's a modal spell with 2 choices. Either we can have a creature we control fight one we don't, or we can counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 3 mana. Yet another Quandrix themed card pulling double duty for us. Despite what I just said about not liking fight effects, we'll take what we can get for removal in these colors, and that's only half the spell. Most of the time though, this is a mana leak for us that'll let us counter a lot of the most troubling spells in the format. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I've already named some of them in this video so far, and I likely will whenever we get to later sections of the video as well. Point is, modal spells are good, more counter spells and more removal is good, that's why we're running 3 copies of it. The last 2 cards on the sideboard are additional copies of Endurance and Subtlety, 1 each. I've already gone over why these cards are good for us, but I feel like in some games it would simply behoove us to have more copies of them, which is why I have a pair hanging out in the sideboard. Not much else to say really, I just wanted some redundancy on some of the best creatures we're running. And that's the deck. 3x+1, or the Colot's Conjecture if you prefer. A Quandrix themed deck that's out to prove that numerology is the best college to attend, obviously. But what if you wanted to have more efficiency than flavor? What if you care about making this deck as powerful as possible with only a minimal amount of flavor? There are several ways to improve the deck in that manner that I will go over now.
Crash! I need the crystals, Crash! I need the crystals to know math, Crash! Please! Give me the crystals, Crash!
So, right off the bat, I'll just go ahead and say what some people have probably been thinking ever since we got to the part where I brought up Hardened Scales. This deck is just a worse version of Hardened Scales. Yes, I know. Thank you for pointing that out, Weenie Weenie Borthos. You're so big-brained. Look, I only hid what this deck was based on for humor purposes. I know full well that this deck doesn't pack a lot of the raw power that cards in Hardened Scales has. But suppose you're an individual who likes the Hardened Scales playstyle. And suppose you also happen to like Quandrix, or math, or both. I don't know, you do you. What I'm getting at is a very easy way that you could upgrade this deck is to add in pieces of Hardened Scales tech while removing out things that you don't personally like. Maybe you don't like one of the wind conditions that this deck is running and would rather have a couple of walking ballistas. Totally valid, go for it. Or maybe you'd like to run some number of hangerback walkers for access to on-demand flyers that can otherwise fulfill the function of all the stuff that has flying in this deck right now. I also think that's a good idea. I almost put it in the deck for that very purpose, but ultimately decided not to for flavor purposes. Point is, you can pretty easily look at hardened scales and get some ideas on ways to improve this deck for an actual tiered modern deck, and it would very much be the first place I look for upgrade suggestions. Next up, let's talk about endurance and subtlety real quick. I've been told that free spells are kinda good, actually, and while I'm skeptical of this claim personally, a lot of people do seem to be running these Evoke Elemental guys from Modern Horizons 2, so maybe they're onto something. Jokes aside, free spells are good, and these creatures, while not as powerful as the other two that remain legal in the cycle, can be very good, and it'd be an easy choice to simply find some space to run more copies of them in the deck. Graveyard-based decks like Dredge are fairly resilient to having their graveyard tucked back into their library after all, so having more than one way to repeatedly do it besides bouncing your one of endurance over and over is worth considering if that matchup concerns you. Similarly, subtlety is annoying to deal with at the best of times, and at the worst can become a legitimate win condition for us if it's out and the Ozolith happens to have a lot of counters on it. Having a more reliable tempo-based plan might be something to consider as well, and if you have some extra copies or don't mind spending a little bit, neither of these are a bad way to go. Lastly, I want to point out another obvious thing about this deck: lack of protection. A lot of the time, our main threats are going to be fractal creature tokens which, by their nature, aren't normally worth protecting, so I didn't feel the need to add some into the deck, personally. But maybe you see this deck and think to yourself, you know what this deck needs? Some fog effects. Well then, good for you. By all means, get this deck some Turbo Fog DNA. In particular, Heroic Intervention would make for an excellent sideboard card, I think, if you want to be extra cautious and give your board some protection. Additionally, if you want a board wipe, you could consider Commander All-Star Cyclonic Rift. Believe it or not, it's not that difficult to get to 7 mana in this deck thanks to Birds of Paradise and Emergent Sequence, plus the elements of the deck that can help slow the game down. So if you really wanted, you could build up your board and then leave your opponent wide open with a well-timed Rift, which would be doubly funny if the turn before you happen to resolve a body of research. Or you could use one of my personal favorite cards, the Curse of Swine, to transmute your opponent's threatening creatures into a bunch of pigs. These colors aren't the ones people normally expect for board wipes, but they exist in a small handful, so you may consider running them in some number if you like having an option to reset your opponent's board in hand. Now we've gone over the deck, we've gone over upgrades you can make if you wanted them, but what about weaknesses? Where does this deck struggle the most? First off is our suite of creatures. Let's be honest, they're not the best, especially since the majority of them are tokens. Each and every one of them put in work for us, but come on. Biomathematician is just a little guy, we're only running one copy of our Evoke Elementals in the main deck, and Quandrix himself kind of needs our board to be set up in order to really shine. We're vulnerable to removal heavy decks, plain and simple. It's extra rough for us as well since Emergent Sequence makes some of our lands into creatures as well, meaning if they get targeted for removal, we're down a land as well. Aside from running protection like Heroic Intervention, though, there's unfortunately not much we can do about that. I know that the saying dies to removal is a bit of a non-argument, but we need our creatures to win games in this deck, whether we're attacking with them or sacrificing them to the altar to mill our opponents out of the game. So be aware of that and act accordingly. The next area this deck is a bit weak is when facing combo decks, or other decks that just in general don't care what we're doing. without in the colors to run a lot of efficient removal, and the counter spells we're playing do not universally counter everything, meaning that we need to have a keen awareness of what we should and shouldn't be worried about when it comes to letting our opponents resolve their cards. If they happen to play something we don't have an answer on the stack for, that's just tough for us. Now, you can remedy this by simply running universal counter spells, like, say, Counterspell, as a random example. The trouble in doing so is that making room for better counter magic means that we're giving up some versatility in our deck somewhere, as all of our counter spells do multiple things for us in this deck. All of this to say that if our opponent is playing Solitaire while we're playing Magic, there's not going to be too much we can do about it usually, unless we happen to have the right counter in hand. Math is oftentimes just theoretical and not practical. That's on theme, right? This deck also takes a lot of setting up to get going. It's by no means slow, not really, but it has a lot of moving parts to it, and those parts are like gears in a wristwatch. We need them to connect to each other to get the whole thing turning. This somewhat goes back to our deck being vulnerable to removal, but it isn't just the creatures that suffer from this. Hardened Scales and the Ozolith Twins don't do anything if we don't have creatures out, and if we don't have our supporting artifacts and enchantments, our creatures perform suboptimally. 3x+1 works best when we're allowed to get a little set up, and that takes time. And while we have plenty of things we can do in between the opening of the game and when we get to set up, that watch isn't going to tick as well if we're missing some gears. In the same vein though, more aggressive decks that don't necessarily care about what we have on board like Burn can also be a problem to deal with. If you can outlast Burn until it runs out of gas by having creatures on board that can block theirs, perfect. But you're almost never going to do that without taking some amount of damage, so you might have survived the first wave, but you're playing on a nice edge from then on. Lastly, and this isn't a point of weakness in the deck itself really, but it kind of is at the same time, this deck is complicated to pilot. Besides needing a bit of setup to get going optimally, players unfamiliar with this deck may find themselves struggling with lines of play that require you to think a few turns ahead and consider the possibilities of what your opponent is playing. For example, let's say it's turn 2 and you have a Birds of Paradise in play along with 2 lands. You have a Solve the Equation in hand, 2 emergent sequences, and a golden ratio. What should you go find off Solve the Equation? Do you get Body of Research, trusting that you'll likely draw another land before turn 4 and thus be able to cast it, while also trusting that the golden ratio may find you an Altar of Dementia so that you can have mill to win? Or do you prioritize getting exponential growth so that you can prepare for the possibility of making one of your fractal lands enormous in a couple of turns? What if you also have a Hardened Scales or a Shattered Spire in hand? What becomes the optimal line of play then? Math, especially theoretical math and unprovable conjectures like the namesake of this deck, is hard, and the complexity of this deck reflects that. There's so many ways that you can go with it, but figuring out which ways are the best takes time, practice, and knowledge of what you're up against. This isn't a beginner-friendly deck, so be prepared to commit to a good amount of time to learning lines of play and or losing a few games at the beginning until you get better at piloting 3x+1. But I feel I've done a pretty good job of fleshing this deck out. I've gone over its strengths, weaknesses, given context on the name of the deck, and made suggestions for upgrades you could make if you were so inclined. What do you think? Let me know down in the comments below. I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and if you do, please consider subscribing for more deck techs in the future, hitting the like button, leaving a comment of some kind, or sharing it with anyone you think might be interested in this kind of content. This is a new channel, and I'm hoping to make a name for myself and all other Vorthos players out there. Until next time, I've been Winnie Weedy Vorthos, and thank you for watching.